In our last lecture, we talked about what happiness, or eudaimonia, is, at least according to a couple of the chapters in the Nicomachean Ethics' first book. We learned that happiness could not be the same thing as the mere possession of virtue, because after all, you could possess virtue while being completely unconscious. No, happiness lies in the activation of the virtues, the activation of certain traits which help us perform our proper functions well. So we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at Metaphysics Theta 6 to talk about what exactly this activation amounts to. Here's some study guide questions. 1. What is an Aristotelian potential? 2. What is it to activate an Aristotelian potential? 3. What are Aristotle's examples of potential and actuality in Theta 6? 4. What are the two types of activation? 5. How are movements different from activities? 6. What does it mean for Aristotle's ethics to say that happiness is an activity? Alright, so, as always, you'll want to take notes during this lecture to pick up the answers to those study guide questions. Let's talk about Aristotelian potentiality and actuality. The first thing to establish is that, for Aristotle, a potential is a way that an individual thing can be given its matter. In other words, the material that something is made of sets certain limits and boundaries to what kind of a thing it can be. The various states and shapes which something can achieve, given the type of matter it's made of, are all of its potentials. Everything that falls within those boundaries and barriers are its potentials. An easy and helpful example is to take a lump of clay. The lump of clay can be various ways. Those are the potentials for the lump of clay, the ways that it can be. So we could say that the lump of clay is potentially a statue of an octopus, or potentially a statue of a person, but it's not potentially a prime number, or potentially a note of music. There are certain things which the clay can be shaped into and can become, and then there's certain things which it cannot be shaped into and cannot become, and the difference between the two is set by the matter of the clay itself, the way that that matter is. Aristotle is often credited with the idea that matter is potential, or that to be material is to be capable of being shaped in various ways. And here we can contrast it with immaterial things, which are fixed and defined and have their being sort of eternally, like Plato thought about the forms. Now, for those of you who enjoy contemporary metaphysics, you'll note that Aristotelian potentialities are a kind of de re modality, or a modality related to things. You could think of potentials as being a lot like dispositions or essences. They're a modal feature of things. Now, if a potential is a way that something can be given its matter, then to activate a potential is to, well, become that way. To activate a potential is to be a certain way, but I want you to consider the word be in an active sense, as though being is something that you do. Being, it's like breathing only quieter, a kind of ticking over. So, more specifically, we should probably say that to activate a potential is to engage in a certain kind of process. It's to do something. When we take the lump of clay, which is potentially a statue, and we activate that potential by making it into a statue, now that clay is being a statue, where this is a certain kind of thing that it's doing. Or, if I have the potential to speak German, I can activate that potential by engaging in a certain process, by doing a certain thing, namely speaking German. Ich kann Deutsch sprechen. And that's how Aristotelian activation works. You've got a potential, and the potential can be activated. When it's activated, then something is going on. There's a pursuit or a process which the bearer of that potential engages in. Now, this is a little difficult to define in the abstract, and Aristotle admits as much in Metaphysics 1048a35. What we wish to say is clear from particular cases by induction, and we must not look for a definition of everything, but be able to comprehend the analogy. He's saying, this potentiality and actuality stuff is difficult to define, but even when you can't define something clearly, you can still give someone a good idea of what it is through analogy and example. So let's take a look at some of Aristotle's examples of potentiality and actuality. What is building is in relation to what is capable of building, and what is awake is in relation to what is asleep, and what is seeing is in relation to what has its eyes closed but has sight, and what has been shaped out of the matter is in relation to the matter, and what has been finished off is to the unfinished. Of the difference exemplified in this analogy, let the activity, or activation, be marked off by the first part, the potentiality by the second. Okay then, so let's consider Aristotle's examples. There is the potential to be building something. Let's say that I have the potential to build something. And then there's the activation of that potential, which is to actually start building things, stacking blocks on top of one another or what have you. In the first case, I'm able to do something that I'm not in fact doing. And in the second case, I'm actively doing it. That is supposed to be a potential and its activation. The potential is a way that I could be, and the activation is a process that I'm engaging in, the process of building. Likewise for being asleep and being awake. To be awake is to activate a number of potentials which are latent while I'm asleep. For instance, seeing, which is Aristotle's next example. There's the potentiality to see. For instance, someone who has working eyes but they're closed. They can see. Seeing is a way that they could be, but they're not seeing. And then there's opening their eyes and engaging in the process of seeing, the activation of that potential. As mentioned before, the material of something is stuff which could be shaped in a variety of ways, and the fact it could be shaped in those ways shows it has potentials, and then the actual bit of matter shaped into something is the activation of one of those potentials. Now, of course, one interesting difference among the various ways that a potential can be activated is that sometimes when you activate a potential, you have a thing that's engaging in some actions, and other times when you activate a potential, the result is a certain type of object existing. Like when the clay's potential to be shaped a certain way is activated, we get a statue, rather than the clay doing something. And this is what Aristotle says next. But things are said to actively be, not all in the same way, but by analogy, as this is in this or to this, so that is in that or to that. For some are as a movement in relation to a capacity, and the others as a substance to some sort of matter. So activating my potential to build is a movement in relation to some capacity, but the clay activating its potential to be shaped a certain way is a substance out of some sort of matter. Here the word substance means object. It's a metaphysician's term for particular thing. Now, although that is an interesting difference among types of activation, it's not the one that we're really focused on. The one that we're focused on is the difference between what he calls movements or processes, or kineses in Greek, and activities, or energeiai in Greek. Movements and activities. Sometimes when you activate a potential, the activation is a movement, and other times when you activate a potential, the activation is a activity. What's the difference between these? Well, Aristotle distinguishes them on the basis of their goals. Since, though, of the actions that have a limit, none is an end, but all are in relation to an end, for example, making thin, and since the things themselves, when one is making them thin, are in movement in this way, namely that what the movement is for the sake of does not yet belong to them, these movements are not cases of action, at least not of complete action, since none is an end. But the sort in which the end belongs really is an action. Alright, what is he saying here? Well, first of all, he's noting that there are some sorts of actions, processes, or some sorts of goings-on, which don't contain their goal within them. They're movements toward a goal. He uses the example of thinning. So suppose that you want to slim down a certain amount. You want to lose a certain amount of weight, let's say. There's a limit or a goal that you are trying to reach, a specific sort of goal. And in the process of slimming, that sort of going on, it's not true that you've already achieved the goal just by engaging in the process. In other words, slimming takes time. This is contrasted with the sort of action in which the end belongs. Let's take a look at his examples. For example, at the same time one is seeing a thing and has seen it, is thinking something and has thought it, is understanding something and has understood it. Whereas, it is not the case that at the same time one is learning something and has learned it, nor that one is being made healthy and has been made healthy. Okay, Aristotle is saying that there are certain sorts of goings-on, certain sorts of pursuits, which are successful every instant at which they're going on. Then, by contrast, there are other sorts of pursuits which take time to be successful, and which are not successful every second in which they are going on. At the end of the chapter, he calls them activities and movements, respectively. And activities are things where they are successful or complete as soon as they occur. So, let's consider first the movement of building, one of Aristotle's own examples. When you build something, it takes time. It's not true that every second in which you are building a house, you have, in that very second, successfully built one. No, the process of building a house is divisible into various stages, and these stages are different from each other, and it's not until all the stages are complete that building a house is done, and the process is successful. Or consider another example of a movement. Slimming. You do not lose weight all at once, you lose it in stages, and it's not until the end of all of those stages in which the process of becoming slim is complete. This is how movements are. Movements have these features. First, when a movement occurs, it is divisible into different parts or stages. The movement is not complete during each of these stages. It only becomes complete at the end of all of them. And also, there is a built-in limit past which the process can no longer occur. A movement has a built-in end to it, or a limit to it, where it just can't keep on going once that limit has been reached. In the process of building the house, once the house is completely done, I can't keep on building it. It's built. In the process of slimming, once I've reached the desired weight, I cannot keep on slimming. I'm slim. It's already been done. So those are the three features that define movements. They're divisible into these different stages. They're not complete until those stages are all done. And once all the stages are done, the movement cannot continue. It's over. Now, an activity, an energei, is the opposite of all of these. An activity is not divisible into stages or parts. An activity occurs instantaneously. It just happens, all of it at once. Moreover, it is successful every second it's going on. It doesn't take time to be complete. There's not different stages it has to run through in order to be completed. It's always done. And finally, unlike movements, activities don't have a built-in limit or endpoint. They can, in principle, go on forever. Now, let's take a look at some of Aristotle's examples and think about them the way that he's thinking about them to see what this is supposed to be. So, his first example is seeing. Let's consider that. For simplicity's sake, let's say seeing red, the color red. Aristotle thought that the cognitive episode of seeing red is not divisible into stages. It's not like, I'm starting to see red, but I haven't quite seen it yet. Sight is in process. There's no sight buffering or any sort of stages for Aristotle. Aristotle thought that sight was immediate. Any second in which you are seeing red is a second in which you have successfully seen it. For Aristotle, it does not take time to see, you just see. And every moment in which you see is a moment in which you have successfully seen. Which takes us to our next note, namely that the activity of seeing is successful every second in which it occurs. Any second in which someone is seeing, they have seen. Contrast this with building or slimming, where it's not true that every second someone is building something, they have in that very second already built it. And finally, note that seeing does not have this built-in terminus, this point at which you can no longer continue to see. You can't, in other words, say, well, I started to see red and then I'm done. I finished. I finished seeing red. Like I finished reading the book or I finished building the house. It's over. You don't finish seeing. You stop, but you don't finish. In principle, the seeing could go on forever. There's nothing about seeing which says it has to stop at a certain point. Unlike slimming or building, where there is a stopping point, it's the point at which the thing becomes slim or built. Or take Aristotle's next example, understanding, or as we might better put it, knowing. Let's take knowing that 2 plus 2 is 4. Let's say that you know that 2 plus 2 is 4. You're sitting there knowing it. As you sit there knowing it, does it take time for you to know it? You start to know it and you're in the middle of the process of knowing and then finally you finish knowing it. Does it work that way? No. For Aristotle, you know it immediately if you know it at all. It takes no time to know it, any more than he thought it took time to see something. And like seeing, knowing is something that successfully occurs every second in which it's going on. If there's a moment in which you are knowing that 2 plus 2 is 4, that's a moment in which you have successfully known that 2 plus 2 is 4. Again, an activity is complete or successful every second in which it's actually occurring. Every second in which it's going on, it's complete. And finally, can you ever be finished knowing that 2 plus 2 is 4? Well, I don't know that 2 plus 2 is 4 anymore. I finished knowing it. No, that doesn't make any sense. Like seeing, knowing is something which, in principle, could just go on forever. There's nothing about the activity of knowing which says it has to stop at some point. Again, unlike processes or movements, like building or slimming, where there's a built-in stopping point. Now, interestingly, and importantly, especially for us, Aristotle's last example of an activity is happiness, or eudaimonia. He says, someone who is living well, however, at the same time has lived well, and is happy and has been happy. So happiness, eudaimonia, the thing that is the human purpose, is some kind of pursuit. It's a pursuit which, like seeing red or knowing that 2 plus 2 is 4, is a simple thing that you just kinda do. And furthermore, we know that it involves some kind of theorizing. We're beginning to get a picture of Aristotle, according to which happiness is something like a kind of enlightenment. That true happiness, the human purpose, the thing that's the point of living, is to do something with your rational capacities, which isn't discursive. It doesn't involve thinking of one thing and thinking of another thing and figuring something out and calculating. For calculating and figuring out, those would all be movements. Remember, it's not true every second in which you are calculating or adding up, you have in that very second finished doing it. No, those are movements. The cognitive action that is happiness for Aristotle would have to be something that is more like just knowing, or more like an intellectual analog of gazing at something, comprehending it or contemplating it. A certain kind of rational contemplation for Aristotle is happiness, is the point of living. As for what, in detail, that cognitive activity is, well, we can find out from the last book of the Nicomachean Ethics, as well as some stuff from Metaphysics Lambda, that it's thinking about the first principle of the universe. We'll talk more about that later. Thanks!
you.